Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final lecture here in Chapter 16. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Inca Empire, which is going to become the dominant empire slash society in South America before the arrival of Europeans. So let's get started. All right, so let's talk about their beginnings. So the Inca, they actually build off very quickly on the foundations of cultures that had been there for thousands of years in South America, whether it's the Chimo, the Moche, and so forth. Um, and they build off of that. Now, they start on a high plateau in the Andes Mountains, and then they move to the Valley of Cusco. So there's a similarity here in terms of how they move into a valley, just like the Aztecs we talk about in the last section. Now, all of these beliefs and this culture coming together and this movement to the Valley of Mexico um, comes together, and they build an empire off of that. And they believe that their rulers were descended of the sun god, and the name of their sun god was Inti, and you can see their representation in gold here of Inti. Now, they had in their society 11 noble lineages, and only men from these 11 noble lines could be leaders within the Inca Empire. All right, so let's talk about the empire itself. So in 1438, their most important ruler, Pachacudi, comes to power. Now, the Inca during his rule come to conquer all of present-day Peru and stretch down into a significant portion of, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and so forth, down the down the spine um, of South America. Now, their empire comes to be about 2,500 miles long um, on the west coast, roughly about the time the Spanish arrived. So this is extensive empire. Now, their land becomes known, or their empire becomes known as the land of the four quarters, because what they do is they split their empire up into 80 different provinces. Again, remember, think of provinces like states. And across this empire is roughly 16 million people, an estimated 16 million people. And now, how did they come to expand their empire to be this large? Well, they did it through not only military campaigns, but they did it also through diplomacy. Again, kind of similar set of tactics we've seen with the Muslims, with Aztecs, with other groups as well, is they do use warfare when it's advantageous to them, but they also will use diplomacy if necessary. Now, typically what Inca empires would do is they used actually a more peaceful way of expansion. They would actually offer terms outside of these cities they would try to take over, and if the terms were accepted, they would just bring them into the empire. Again, kind of a similar, but a little bit differently, a little bit more peaceful overall in what they ended up doing if there were they didn't accept terms than that of the Mongols that we talked about earlier. All right, so this empire was so large and was very thin, and it was very thin because of the Andes Mountains. They couldn't extend very far inland, so that's why they ended up extending southward, and it becomes this narrow strip of land. Well, that's all well and great. There's a lot of resources, a lot of people, and so forth, but because of the actual layout of this empire, not only because of the mountains themselves, but because it's just so long and narrow, it's actually quite difficult to get from one end to the other of the empire without having some system that's developed in place. And not only did dividing the empire into provinces and setting up a strong central government or bureaucracy help actually govern the empire itself, but what also helped bring this empire together was the people that were part of this spoke the same language known as Quechua, and they were able to build an extensive road system that allowed not only communication but trade and movement of troops to take advantage of moving. They used this to take advantage of moving those long distances when they needed to. Now, another thing that helped and why the road system became so well built was the Inca were master engineers, and they did this without the technology of the wheel. Now, how they built everything, they built all the roads to go to their capital city, Cusco. Again, I mentioned it in the last lecture. I'm going to say the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, in the Inca Empire, all roads lead to Cuzco. All right, so now let's move on to their government. Their government, it was basically like a socialistic system, right? They controlled the means of production. They controlled where things went. They collected and distributed the goods. There was very little private trade. So it was very uncommon in the Inca system for people to actually have their own businesses and trade with other people. Everything was done by distribution and collection and trade by the government itself, or the system that was set in place by it. Now, their social system, and this is a vocab term for you guys, was known as the Ailu. And the Ailu was an operating social system that included the extended family to help build canals, build granaries to store food, help others out in harsh times, basically help provide some kind of service towards the government or towards the public system. And the Ailu structure was governed on the decimal system in terms of how they would actually divide people into groups. So, like, you'd have as little as 10 people all the way up to as many as 10,000. And each of these groups was led by like a chief. So that way you had some kind of system of leadership from the bottom up. And again, this not only helped with the social aspects of the empire, it helped make sure that the government controlled the production and distribution of goods. Now, typically, because of the extensiveness of this empire, local leaders were allowed to rule their own areas, but they still offered it and structured it off of this system. Now, people had to pay tribute to the Inca ruler through labor. They had to provide some form of labor as payment or tribute to the Inca ruler each year, and they called that the mita. Now, I forgot to put the apostrophe there in the slide, so I apologize. But the mita was their tribute towards the actual Inca ruler. And that was a significant part of this system to not only, again, help the social system work, but help the government function. All right, here you guys can see the Inca social structure. So basically how this works is you have the ruling family, okay, the royalty. They were the Sapa Inca family. You have the nobility that's underneath them. Okay, basically this is the other 10 families of noble bloodlines, and then you have the Ailu, which is the actual structure for the public. Okay, and how they can provide services and so forth to the government and to the society. So you have the general public, the Hatan Runa, the Mitiames, which were the newly conquered people, so anybody that was brought in through conquered lands, and the Yanaconas, which were those that were basically prisoners or slaves. All right, so now we're going to talk about their works and their records. So the Inca system, again, as I already mentioned, was very close to modern day socialism, with kind of a mixture into totalitarian or command economy. But it was mostly socialistic because you have people working for the public good and government control of full production and distribution. So their programs were all based on public works. So those roads not only got built because they were expert engineers, but because of the Ailu system and the mita labor that you had to pay out each year as tribute to your ruler. Now, one thing that the Inca also did is they developed a postal service that stretched across the entire empire as well, using runners known as chesquis. And this allowed for effective communication, movement of records, and so forth. All right. And then the roads had an added benefit in terms of defense. They could move troops from one end of the empire to the other fairly quickly. I mean, we're not talking, at lightning speeds because they still had to walk, but they could move and had direct routes to go places. Now, perhaps what's even their greatest accomplishment is that the Inca actually didn't have a written language, so Quechua was just a spoken language. So they had everything built on an oral tradition, so they actually had to figure out some kind of way without using writing to have a record system. And this is really, really cool. Fortunately, we don't have time to actually make one of these in class. I wish we did. But they developed a system known as Kipu, which is a system of knotted strings and colors to account for things and take records of whether it was, how much they were trading or how much they were making, and so forth. And then they developed a calendar for their own religious purposes. So this moves us into the actual religion of the Inca. The religion actually helped reinforce the power of the state because, again, their ruler is viewed as a god or linked to the gods. And just like all the other North American and other Native American groups we've talked about, they believed that there had to be some kind of balance in nature, and they worshipped, things like the moon, the sun, stars, thunder, all the things that we link in nature as important. Now, their creator god was Viracocha, and you can see Viracocha here. And they viewed that he's the one that created their world. And now, even though he's the creator, they viewed that their kings were descended from their most important god that they worshiped to was Inti, the sun god, which I previously mentioned. Now, in terms of how the system worked religiously, they did have high priests, but typically they would actually have religious servants that would help work things out with the royal family and nobility. And the Mamakuna would be the female servants, and Yamakuna were male servants. That was their title. And they were lifetime state workers. They worked to represent whoever was in control and helped the state from a religious standpoint, which again helped reinforce the power of the state. Now, they did not practice, the Inca, as far as I know, and as far as we know, they didn't practice human sacrifice, but they would sacrifice llamas to give the blood debt to their gods. Now, the Inca themselves, they developed some really important great cities. There's two specifically we're going to take a look at. The first one's Cusco. That was their capital. It was rich in gold. It was called they viewed God or gold as the sweat of the sun. So they closely link gold with their sun god Inti, which is why you see him often recreated in gold. And they built a temple in Cusco to represent or worship, Inti, their sun god, and they covered and lined, as the story goes, that the entire walls with gold to pay homage and represent it for him. But that was their capital city. Another important city, which wasn't discovered until just a little over 100 years ago, was Machu Picchu. And Machu Picchu wasn't discovered until 1912 because it was highly isolated in the Andes Mountains. And you can kind of see it why in the picture here, in the picture that was on the title slide for this lecture, but you're really going to see it here on the next one. But Machu Picchu, we don't really have an understanding of really what its main purpose was. We know that it's this great city. It's huge. It's these great ruins we can go see. We don't know if it was just a private estate for Pachacudi, or it was a religious center or whatever. But we do know that it was grandiose and awesome, and it's this central plaza surrounded by all these temples and public buildings and all this stuff. But here, you guys are going to see just how isolated it is on the next slide. I mean, that is such a difficult... Think about having to try to get there. If you talk to Mr. Jackson, he's been there. Let him tell you the stories there. It's so hard to get there. And hopefully some of you guys, including I would love this, to actually go down to Peru and be able to visit Machu Picchu at some point. All right, now we're going to get to the last slide here. We're going to talk about really what ends up happening to the Inca. By the early 1500s, they're at the height of their power. The empire is doing very well. It's at its greatest extent. It's covered most land. The system's working. However, their ruler, there's a bad omen that happens. Their ruler, Huayna Capac, he's given a gift box, and he opens it. Well, in that box, once he opens it, these moths fly out, and it's viewed as this bad omen by the Inca. And it just so happens that he ends up dying just a few weeks later. Now here's what happens. The empire splits into a civil war between his sons. Huáscar and Atahualpa start fighting over who's going to gain control of the throne. Now, Atahualpa wins in a fairly quick war, but the empire is weakened. He doesn't have full control. They've got to reorganize everything. They're in a weakened state. Well, this is literally just so happens to happen right around the same time the Spanish are showing up on the shores of South America. And the Spanish are able to come in under Francisco Pizarro, and take advantage of a situation. And they quickly conquer and take over the Incan Empire. And how they do it is Pizarro it actually is able to negotiate a meeting at a place that he is set up at already with Atahualpa. He gets Atahualpa to agree to come in, and they ambush Atahualpa and take him captive. And in this struggle, Atahualpa is mortally wounded. And this, again, causes a further power vacuum, because now their emperor, their new one, is going to be dead shortly, and the Spanish are going to conquer this empire very quickly, and the Inca Empire is going to fall. All right, here you guys can see a famous painting. This is called The Death of Atahualpa. You can see Atahualpa has died here, and you've got women, native women, are just beside themselves here off to the side, and with the Spanish around it. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Hope you enjoyed the lectures for Chapter 16. Please make sure you guys go back and review the lecture notes and do well on that test. See ya.